Hello everyone and welcome to CjMeds. In this video, I will be discussing about the pathways of the basal ganglia. In the previous video, we have discussed about the complete anatomy of the basal ganglia, that is, its structure, components and its functions. Let's start this video with a quick recap about the components of the basal ganglia. So here I have taken the coronal section of the brain and we are looking at it from the anterior side. So we can see a bunch of different structures here. Let's start with the first one, the caudate nucleus. The second part is the putamen. Remember one important thing here, that the caudate nucleus and the putamen together are called as the striatum of the basal ganglia. Remember this. Then the third structure here is globus pallidus. But it's actually two parts, an internal part and an external part. They are called as the globus pallidus internus and globus pallidus externus respectively. Here we have to look upon a new term. When we combine the putamen and the globus pallidus together, this makes an important structure called as the lentiform nucleus. So the caudate nucleus and putamen make the striatum and the putamen and globus pallidus make the lentiform nucleus. Then the fourth structure we see is the thalamus. To be more specific here, the thalamus has two important motor nuclei, that is the ventero-anterior nucleus of the thalamus and the venterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. So when we say that thalamus is a part of the basal nuclei, then we are being very particular about these two nucleus, that is the ventero-anterior nucleus and venterolateral nucleus. The fifth component of basal ganglia is the subthalamic nucleus. And the last structure or the sixth component we have here is the substantia nigra, which is actually situated in the midbrain. There are two parts of substantia nigra, the zona compacta and zona reticularis. The one that we care here is this pathway is the zona compacta. It is the one that contains the dopaminergic neurons. Okay, so we have established the components of the basal ganglia. Before going towards the pathway, let's discuss one last thing here about the functions of the basal ganglia, which is the motor function. We know that the motor function is coordinated by the cerebral cortex. We have different regions in the cortex which are involved in the motor function. Here if we look at the central sulcus, behind the central sulcus we have a somatosensory cortex, and then anterior to it we have a motor cortex and the premotor cortex. These structures decide our voluntary motor movements. They send information down to the muscles via the upper and lower motor neurons and cause the muscle to contract and relax. So this is called as the corticospinal tract. In order to have this motor plan go forward, we need to have a connection with the basal ganglia. These cerebral cortex areas have to communicate their motor plan with the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia will take that motor plan and make a well coordinated plan and send it back to the cerebral cortex. It sends the new motor plan to start the movement, stop the movement, or modulate the movement. These are the three primary functions of the basal ganglia: to start movement, stop movement, and modulate the motor movement. It actually starts or activates the motor movement, then stops the unwanted motor movement and modulate different motor movements. So now as we know everything, let's start about the pathways. We will talk about the three particular pathways: the direct pathway, indirect pathway and the nigrostriatal pathway. The reason why they are important is because they tell us the three important functions: to start movement, to stop movement and to somehow modulate the movement. The first pathway we will discuss is the direct pathway. Remember that this is designed to stimulate or activate the motor activity. As I said earlier, the cortex has to send its plan to the basal ganglia, which will send it back to the motor cortex. So we have to go from cortex to the basal ganglia and then back to the cortex. The neurons in the cortex will send their axons down to the striatum, which is actually made up of the caudate nucleus and putamen. So the nuclei in the putamen and caudate nucleus will send their axons towards the globus pallidus internus. Then from the globus pallidus internus, These neurons will then go to the thalamus, to the ventrolateral and ventroanterior nucleus. This nucleus will extend their axons back to the cerebral cortex. This is the basics of direct pathway. Now let's get more deep and look on towards the mechanism of this pathway. From the cortex to the striatum, these fibers are called as glutaminergic fibers. That means the neurotransmitter that these fibers release is glutamate, which is a stimulatory neurotransmitter which will activate the next neuron. That means the cortex send positive action potential to the striatum, which will stimulate the neurons in the striatum. Now the nucleus in the striatum will send their neurotransmitter to the globus pallidus internus. The neurotransmitter which is released here is actually GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid, which is inhibitory neurotransmitter. So the axons from striatum are gonna inhibit the nucleus in the globus pallidus internus. Now the axons going from the globus pallidus internus to the thalamus will have decreased action potential, and if there is decreased action potential, it means that there is less release of neurotransmitter at the thalamus. The type of neurotransmitter that's released here is again GABA, which is a inhibitory neurotransmitter. So if I am having less action potential, then I will have less GABA onto the thalamic nuclei. That means I have less inhibition. So it means that the thalamic nuclei are released from inhibition, and this nucleus in the thalamus are now stimulated. And if they are stimulated, they are going to send action potential to the motor cortex, which will complete the goal of increasing the motor activity of the desired skeletal muscle. And this is how the direct pathway work. That is what I want you guys to remember about the direct pathway. Now let's move forward and talk about the indirect pathway. As we talked about the direct pathway, which is designed to stimulate the motor movement, start the motor movement, and what is the other function of basal ganglia? It is to inhibit the motor activity, or in other words, it is to stop the unwanted motor movement. This function of the basal ganglia is carried via the indirect pathway of the basal ganglia. And again, the basic function I want you to remember is that this is to decrease the motor activity. So again the same concept, just here we have a different route. So starting with the cortex, we have our axons going to the striatum. They will act on the neurons in the striatum. Then from the neurons of the striatum, we have axons which instead of going to the globus pallidus internus, they will go to the globus pallidus externus. Then from the globus pallidus externus, these axons move downwards to the subthalamic nuclei of the components of basal ganglia. From the subthalamic nucleus, we have axons that go back to the globus pallidus but the internal component, that is the globus pallidus internus. From globus pallidus internus, these axons go to the thalamus. What type of nuclei of thalamus we are saying here? The ventroanterior and ventrolateral nucleus of thalamus. And then the fibers from these nuclei are sent back up to the cortex. This is our basic indirect pathway. Now let's take a look at the mechanism. Coming from cortex to striatum, what neurotransmitter we have here? This is glutamate, which is a stimulatory neurotransmitter. So what is it going to do? It will stimulate these neurons present in the striatum. These neurons in the striatum will now send their action potential towards the globus pallidus externus. Their neurons release GABA. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. If there is lot of action potential, it means a lot of GABA is being released into the neurons. It is going to be heavily inhibited. Now this neuron of globus pallidus externus will send less action potential to the subthalamic nucleus. And the neurotransmitter released here is again GABA. So less action potential means less neurotransmitter. That means less GABA. And less GABA means less inhibition. That means this neuron is now released from inhibition and it is actually stimulated now. It will send action potential from subthalamic nucleus to the globus pallidus internus, and the neurotransmitter released here is the glutamate. So lots of action potential means lot of neurotransmitter. That's more number of glutamate. Glutamate is a stimulatory neurotransmitter, so it will heavily stimulate the neurons of the globus pallidus internus, and this will result in increased action potential from globus pallidus internus to the nuclei of the thalamus. That means a lot of neurotransmitter is being released here. The neurotransmitter is GABA. GABA is inhibitory. So lots of GABA means lots of inhibition of the thalamic nuclei. That means the thalamus there will be decreased action potential to the cortex. And if there is decreased action potential going to the cortex, guess what is that going to tell to the motor cortex? That we have to decrease the motor activity of the given body part. Doesn't that make sense? So that's how the indirect pathway works. Now, as we have discussed about increasing the motor activity and decreasing the motor activity, let's discuss about how we can modulate the activity of both the direct pathway and the indirect pathway. Let's come over to this last part and start the discussion about the so-called Nigrostriatal pathway. Let's first talk about how it influences the direct pathway. So we have our direct pathway here, from the cortex to the striatum, from striatum to the globus pallidus internus, and from globus pallidus internus to the thalamus, and from nuclei of the thalamus to the cortex. This is our direct pathway. Now here we add in this extra pathway from the substantia nigra. Remember, we have this zona compacta. From zona compacta, we have this neuron that ascend upward and go to the striatum. And what they do is they release dopamine onto the actual neurons of the striatum. On the striatum, they attach to the D1 receptor and produce a stimulatory effect. Now let's see what happens in the direct pathway due to this stimulatory effect. From the cortex coming down to the striatum, what did we say we were releasing? Glutamate. Glutamate is stimulating these neurons. Right on top of that, we also have this dopamine that is also going to be released. And now, what do we just say? Dopamine is acting on the D1 receptor of this nuclei and stimulating them. So now you have an extra stimulus from the cortex and substantia nigra. So the neurons going from striatum to the globus pallidus internus will fire with extra action potential. What does that mean? The neurotransmitter that's going to be released here will be released in large amounts on this globus pallidus internus. The neurotransmitter is GABA. If there's a lots of GABA, it means there will be a lots of inhibition. So the nucleus of globus pallidus internus will be super inhibited. That means it is going to send very less GABA to the thalamus. Less GABA in the thalamus means there's a significant decrease in inhibition that's going to result in extra stimulation of the thalamic nuclei. So the thalamic nuclei are going to fire lots of action potential back to the cerebral cortex, and this will tell the cortex to increase the motor activity which was already present. So this increases the motor activity even more. This is why important. Whenever there's a damage to the direct pathway in some way, or you want to increase the motor activity, if you damage this pathway, say particularly you damage the substantia nigra, do you know what disease will be caused due to this? A very particular disease called as the Parkinson disease. In Parkinson's disease, they have the difficulty initiating the movement and maintaining the movement. Right? Why? Because you have damaged the direct pathway with the nigrostriatal involvement. And now you can't perform that motor activity very well. So that's kind of a classic thing that I want you to remember here. Now let's talk how the striatal pathway influences the indirect pathway. Let's take our indirect pathway here, from the cerebral cortex to the striatum. This is also a good recap going on, right? From striatum to the globus pallidus externus, from globus pallidus externus to the subthalamic nucleus, from subthalamic nucleus we go back to the globus pallidus internus, and from the globus pallidus internus to the thalamic nuclei, particularly the ventro-anterior and ventrolateral nucleus, and then from here back up to the cortex. Now we have to add in that extra pathway which is really important here, that is coming from the substantia nigra, the nigrostriatal pathway. Again, the neurons of the zona compacta come here and send axons to the striatum. Now the type of receptor present on striatum in this indirect pathway is actually called the D2 receptor. And what I want you to remember about this D2 receptor is that it is a inhibitory receptor. So when dopamine is going to released here on this receptor, it is going to cause inhibition. Alright, now let's follow the pathway. From the cortex, what do we say you are releasing? Lots of glutamate, which has a stimulatory effect onto these neurons. But then you have dopamine that's going to be released onto the D2 receptor, which is causing inhibition. So now think about this. You have normal stimulation, but then coming from substantia nigra, you have increased inhibition. What does that mean? Well, normally you would be sending lots of action potential from striatum to globus pallidus externus. But because we have some inhibition to those neurons, now there's going to be decreasing action potential moving from striatum to globus pallidus externus. What does that mean? That means less neurotransmitter is released here, less GABA. GABA is inhibitory in nature, so less GABA means less inhibition. So the neurons of globus pallidus externus will get stimulated and send increasing action potential. Increased action potential means increased neurotransmitter release. What type of neurotransmitter released here? GABA. GABA is inhibitory. That means it will cause increased inhibition of the subthalamic nuclei. If that's the case, then there is decreased action potential carried from subthalamic nucleus to the globus pallidus internus. Decreased action potential means decreased neurotransmitter. And what type of neurotransmitter released here? Glutamate. If there is less glutamate, what does that mean? It means that there is less stimulation of these neurons. So we can say that it is slightly inhibited. So it will release decreased action potential to the thalamus. That means less neurotransmitter. Like which one? GABA. Decreased GABA means decreased inhibition. So now the nuclei of the thalamus are released from inhibition and they will get stimulated and fire more action potential to the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex will get stimulated and the motor activity that you were designed to decrease, now you are going to increase that motor activity. But again, what type of motor activity is increased? And unwanted motor activity will be increased. So remember, in direct motor pathway, you increase the desired or wanted motor activity. But here in indirect pathway, you increase the undesired or unwanted motor activity. Hope you got this concept clear in your mind. So this was all about the pathways of the basal ganglia. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel to watch more videos from CjMeds. Hope you enjoyed. See you in the next video. Till then, stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks for watching.